This lesson is securing web APIs with JSON Web Tokens. The objectives for this lesson are to learn about security in ASP.NET. We're going to add in the JSON Web Token package. We're going to learn to configure authentication. We're going to create a set of security classes. We will generate a JWT token, and we're going to secure endpoints using claims. Regardless of what security scheme you use, there are certain things that are in common. For example, security means authentication, where a user proves who they are via some sort of credentials. And this allows them access to the site or to the set of APIs. Authorization means what a user can do once they've been granted access to the site or to the set of APIs. And authorization can be role-based, where user is assigned to one or many roles. It can also be claims-based, or specific actions that they can perform, where a user is assigned one or more claims. We can then secure each endpoint based on the role or the claims. There are many methods available to us to authenticate users. We can use ASP.NET Core Identity, which includes classes and a whole structure to help us manage users, passwords, profile data, roles, claims, all sorts of things. We have external login providers, so you could actually authenticate through Facebook, Google, maybe a Microsoft account or a Twitter account. We have JSON Web Tokens, which is what we're going to use in this lesson. And we have OpenID Connect and OAuth 2.0 framework. So many ways that you can authenticate. Well, let's take a look at adding authentication and then adding an authorized attribute to one of our endpoints. Open the program.cs, and right down here, maybe right after where we configure Serlog, let's add and then configure the authentication. So we have to turn on that service. Then down here, way down where it says use authorization, what we're going to do there is we're going to add in this app.use authentication and then app.use authorization. Those two will always go together, and they will go in that order. Let's now open up our weather forecast controller. And we haven't really done much with this one, of course. But locate the endpoint, which is the get, and add in this authorize attribute. The authorize attribute now, when we run this, will prevent us from doing anything because we haven't been authorized yet. We've done no authentication other than said we wanted to use authentication. So if we run this and we come down here and we click on this get and try it out and execute, you'll see that we actually get a 500 error. So that's an internal server error. And it says no authentication scheme was specified, and there was no default challenge scheme found. And then there's some other information here. But that tells us right there, all we've done is say add authentication, but we haven't told it how we're going to authenticate, right? There's no scheme that we have said. And a scheme would be something like that, ASP.NET Core Identity or JSON Web Tokens or something like that. So that's what we have to do. JSON Web Tokens, called a bearer token, is not really an authentication scheme, but it is something that is used to prove that a user has been authenticated. It's an open standard for securely transmitting information, and it uses a JSON object that's been digitally signed using a secret key or even a public and private key pair. A JWT consists of three parts: the header, the payload, and the signature. If you have this JSON object, you can actually decode the token and see what's in it at JWT.io, and I'll show you that in just a little bit. Like I just said, a JWT bearer token is in the format header.payload.signature. So the following is simply broken at the dots on the slide here just to show you what it looks like, but in truth, they're not broken across lines like this. This is the header part, this is the payload part, and then this is the signature. The header portion of that token tells us what the signing algorithm was used and the type of token. It's typically JWT, but there are other types of tokens. The payload contains things like the subject, the JSON Web Tokens identifier, a time the token is valid, the time the token expires, the time the token was issued, the issuer, and then the audience. And then there's as many private claims as you wish to add. So private claims would be things that we add like is authenticated, get a product, add product, update product. So these are the claims that we're saying this user has. And we'll figure out how to do that in just a bit. Now there's two packages that we're going to have to add in to our ASP.NET project in order to make these work. There's system identity model.tokens.jwt, Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Authentication.jwt bearer. We then have to configure JWT with a secret key, an issuer, an audience, and the minutes to expiration. We then have to authenticate a user with some sort of credentials. Based on that, we're going to generate and return a bearer token for that authenticated user. And then the user must pass this token each time they call one of our Web API endpoints. So that is just a communication that goes back and forth between the server and the client, and that client must supply that because that has their credentials. That says what they're allowed to do on that site. Let's add the JSON Web Token packages to our Web API project. Right mouse click on the project, select Manage NuGet Packages. You're then going to want to search for system.identitymodel.tokens.jwt. Now again, you always want to check and make sure you've got the right version here and not one for something else. So this one we'll go ahead and install. And as long as you don't get an error down here in the error list area that tells you that it's for the wrong version, you know you're okay. The next thing we'll look up then is the Microsoft ASP.NET Core Authentication JWT bearer. This one you need to look at because you can see, depending on the .NET version you're using, if you're using .NET 7, you can use this 703. If you're using .NET 6, like I am here, you want to go back to 6.014. You can see the dependencies right down here. It says .NET 6. So let's go ahead and install that one, and again, accept any terms. Next, open up your appsettings.development.json, and we're going to add some of the information that I talked about. We're going to add it right in here within the AdventureWorks API. So within this object, we're going to create a JWT settings. And remember I said we needed some sort of signing key? This is the key, and it's just some long made-up string of words or letters or characters or whatever you want to do that is a secret from everybody else. The issuer then needs to be this particular Web API project. So I should go look up what my number is here. So you can see 5269 is the one that we're running under. So make sure you use the appropriate one there. The audience is just, I call it the name of my project, AdventureWorks API. And how long do I want this token to live? And that's something that is up to you, and you need to decide what to do with that token once it expires. Do you renew it, or is it something that you're going to have the user re-authenticate each time? Now go over to the entity layer and let's add a new class called JWT Settings. And inside of here, we're going to create the properties that match up to that JSON object we just created in the appsettings.development.json, right? So we'll have a key, an issuer, an audience, and the minutes to expiration. Once we have that, go over to AdventureWorks API defaults. And inside of here, let's create an instance of that as a property. And then we'll go ahead and initialize it here, like so. So by putting it under here, that means that those settings are already going to be read in because they are a part of this JSON object, and we've already got code to assign that to the class. In fact, we can run this and prove this. So we come here to the assign to class. Remember, this is the one that takes it and assigns it to the class. And right there, we can now see that settings class now has everything, including our JWT settings that are read from the JSON file. You remember the error we received when we tried to run that weather forecast endpoint. It said that we had no authentication scheme registered. Well, let's register JWT as our authentication method. open up the service extension.cs, and we're going to add a new method here. Now, this method is actually quite lengthy, but it's just, again, extending the iService collection class here. We're also going to pass in, though, the AdventureWorks API defaults, because we need those settings if we're going to be setting up our JWT. Now, you don't have to understand everything going on in this code, but it is fairly simple. We're going to add authentication to our services. Remember, we already did that before, but we're going to replace it with this method. And the options are going to set the default authenticate scheme, the default challenge scheme, the default scheme to all be that JWT bearer defaults.authentication scheme. So this isn't one of those packages that we brought in. Then we're going to add JWT bearer. So this is basically the options that are used to create the bearer token. So down here, let's scroll down just a little bit, where you can see that we're going to create a new token validation parameters, right? A bearer token. We're going to create some token validation parameters, such as who's the valid issuer, who's the valid audience, what's our issuer signing key. Remember, we put all of those into our JSON file. So the issuer signing key is a new symmetric key using that key that we created, that big long string of nonsense there. And then we have a clock skew, which says how many minutes to expiration. If you remember, we put like 10 minutes. So there is a method that we're going to call from our program.cs. Let's add one more as well. This one's very simple. It's just add authorization. We'll add a little bit more to this in just a minute. So let's go back here now to our program.cs, and where we had previously said add authentication. Remember, we added that in. Now we're going to call our method there configure JWT authentication, and we're going to pass in that AdventureWorks API so we can grab that data. And then we call the configure JWT authorization as well. And like I said, we'll do more of that in just a bit. Now, what happens though when we actually run this, okay, and just make sure that do we have anything different than what we had before? So let's come down here to our get weather forecast, and again, we'll execute this. Remember, this has the authorized attribute. Aha! So now it's given us a 500 error internal server error, but all it does is say, well, there's something wrong with this. It really doesn't know what's wrong at this point because we really still haven't finished everything. Other than we haven't created the bearer token, we've just configured what it's going to be looking like with those parameters, but we haven't created it yet. So let's go ahead and figure out how to do that. So really that 500 error is an unauthorized call, right? Because we're saying that somebody has to be authorized to call that weather forecast. So how do we handle that unauthorized call? Let's find out. An unauthorized call is a 401. Open up your error controller and let's handle the 401. So we'll just add a new case statement here and just say you are not authorized for this route. And then the route should come up with our message, right? Because we're actually saying what was the route they were trying to get at. And then we are going to return here the 401 on unauthorized. So if we do that and we run this now, perfect. That's what we wanted. A 401, they are unauthorized for this route. We've got the configuration kind of set up and ready to go. We've now handled where they're not authorized because there is no bearer token. So we're well on our way now to getting closer to getting security in our Web API project. Now the next step on our long road here to getting security installed into our Web API project is to create a set of security classes. The first one we'll create is app user. This holds the username and the password. And of course, you could add whatever other user information you want to this class. But this is going to help us determine if they have access to the site. Then we'll have an app user claim class that holds claim information for a user. So that's what they're allowed to do on the site. We'll create an app security token class that holds user and the claim objects and is also going to hold our JWT bearer token. Let's go ahead and create these three security classes right now. Right mouse click on the project and let's add a new folder called Security Classes. And let's add a new class called app user. Now this class is going to have 4 properties. We'll have a unique user ID, which is a GUID. We'll have the username, we'll have the password, and is authenticated. Now, I would always highly recommend you put JSON ignore on the password. You never want to run the risk of this class being serialized and the data going down back to your user. That would not be good. The next thing we'll add is another class here, and this class is going to be called app user claim. This one will hold a claim ID, a unique ID. This will hold the reference to the user that these claim, or this one claim actually goes against, and then it'll be the claim type and the claim value, and we'll see examples of what these are a little later. The next class we'll add here is called app security token, and this class will have an instance of our app user. It will have the bearer token, which is this big long string, and it'll have a list of the claims associated with that user. Now that we have these little entity classes that holds data, we need something to populate those. So let's create a security manager class with a public-facing method that will be passed the username and password, and this is what we then have as the endpoint that the user can call and pass their credentials. It will take those credentials and pass them to this little protected validate user method that performs the lookup in the data store to find out if that user is valid. And that data store can be wherever. I'm just going to use hard-coded values for this lesson. Then we're going to have a method that loads the user claims. Once the user's been authenticated, we now load up all the claims for that authenticated user. And then there will be a build JWT claims. So we're going to create some JWT claims that will go into the bearer token payload. And we have a protected method called setJWT that just creates the bearer token using that user and claim information. Let's create our security manager class. Right mouse click on the security classes folder, add a class called security manager. Now this is quite a large class, and again, I don't expect you to understand everything going on in here, but you'll get the general idea. So here's our public-facing endpoint that we could actually put out there and say, okay, if you want to authenticate to our site, you need to call us with the name and the password. So this will actually be called from an endpoint, because we're also going to need to have it pass in those JWT settings, right? We need that data in order to build the bearer token. Inside of this is the main guy. We're going to create an app security token object by calling the validate user method. Once we get the user validated and we have this security token, we'll check, make sure they came back as authenticated, and then we'll load their user claims, and then we'll build the application security token. Let's take a look at the other methods then. So the validate user, this is where you would go out and you would go to some sort of data store, passing the name and the password and figuring out whether this is a valid user. I simply have 2 users here, Paul S., John K., with a password of very unique password. But inside of here then, I'm going to fill in the user object on that app security token with the name that was passed in, a unique GUID, and that they are authenticated. Anybody else would not be authenticated. Next, I need to load the user claim. So I would take that security token that has the user in it, I would pass it here, and then line 66, I do a switch on that user name. Now here we wouldn't do a switch, we'd actually go out to a data store, all right? But you get the idea. But if it's Paul S., I'm going to add some claims. So the claim type will be get products, the claim value true, which means Paul S. has the right to get products. Then the next claim would be get a product. The claim value, again, would be true. So I have the right to get a product, and I would have the right to search. If it's John K. who's authenticated, he has a get a product claim, he has an add product claim, and he has an update product claim. So now the claims have been created for these users, or the one user who's logged in currently. We now have this setJWT token method that is called. The first thing it does is it takes our app security token object, passes it to this build JWT claims. So where is that? That's down here. Now this one is the one that actually uses the system.security. As you can see here, this claim, right? So we're creating this list of claims under system.security.claims, and it builds unique names. So we've got a JWT registered claim names, there's a .sub, there's a .jti, and if you remember my slide, those were actually in there, and we're going to see what these do. But sub is subject, and we're going to use the username as the subject. We need a unique token, so I'm just going to generate a new GUID, and then we're going to add our isAuthenticated claim. Then we're going to add our custom claim. So we're going to loop through the claims that we retrieved out of our data store, because what we have in there is not a real system.security.claims claim. So we have to actually build a real new claim here with that claim type and that claim value. So now I have a collection, right? A list of claims, regular system.security claims. All right, so now that we've got this back, we're now going to create our security descriptor. And the security token descriptor is going to have our expiration, the issuer, the audience. Remember, we're getting all of that from those settings, those JWT settings. The signing credentials, we're going to create a new signing credentials using this HMAC SHA 512 signature security algorithm, passing in that key, right? That symmetric security key we're going to create from that long key that we have. And then the subject are going to be the claims identity of the claims. We then create a JWT security token handler. We do a token handler.writeToken, and we pass the token descriptor that we created with all that information. We pass that to this token handler.createToken method. This is what then finally gives us back our bearer token. So this is just a string value that comes back. We take that string representation of our whole JWT token and we put it into our app security token bearer token property. Okay, that's a lot of code. The great thing is this is mostly black box. You can configure most of it through the JWT settings. You really shouldn't have to touch this too much. Okay, it's been a lot to get to this point, but we're finally there where we can now generate a JSON Web Token. We can generate this bearer token with all the data we have. Let's add a security controller that we can use to generate that JWT. Right mouse click on the controllers folder and add a class called Security Test Controller. This is just a regular Web API controller that inherits from our controller base API. We have a private read-only AdventureWorks API default settings. We're going to have injected that iOptions monitor that's going to come in, and we're going to use that to get the current values in our JSON folder. And of course, we're getting the logger and passing that right down to our controller base API class. Then here is our route. Authenticate user, name, and password. So obviously we have the two replaceables there, the name and the password. So this is what gets brought over to us. And it could return a status 200, which means they're authenticated, or a 401, unauthorized. So you can see inside of here, I'm going to create an action result out of the app security token, because I want to get all that user information plus the bearer token is in there. So I do a new security manager.authenticate user, passing in the name, the password, and the JWT settings object from our settings class. This returns us the app security token object that has a user object in it that says whether or not they were authenticated. If they were, we pass back a status of 200 with that app security token. Otherwise, we pass back a 401 unauthorized, and I got a little message, invalid username or password. All right, let's try it out. So we now have this new security test. We'll try this out. We'll put in John K. The password we'll put in as password. We execute this. And there it is. Look at that. There's our app security token. It has the user ID, which is a unique GUID. The username, the isAuthenticated, is set to true. There's that bearer token. And then we have an array of claims that this user is allowed, right? So get a product, add product, update product. Now let's try something that's invalid, and let's do an execute, and we should get back that 401, so unauthorized, and an invalid username or password. One of the things I mentioned is that we can actually take that bearer token and display the contents of what are in it. Let's take a look at how to do that. Back here in our Authenticate user endpoint, make sure you have a valid name, either John K. or Paul S., and execute. And then we're going to grab this bearer token here. We'll copy that to the clipboard. We'll now go over here to JWT.io. And if we scroll down a ways, it says put in your encoded token here. And look at that. It actually shows us everything about this JWT token. The algorithm is that HMAC SHA 512. The type is a JWT. You can see the subject. We can see the identifier. They're authenticated. They have get a product, add product, update product as claims. And then we have all those other standard ones that were talked about. Now you got to remember, this is all just base 64 encoded. There's no, it's not like it's secret. None of this should be a secret. There's no secrets in here. There's no password. There's nothing else. The great thing is that if somebody changes even one thing by trying to add on something else, they can't do that without your secret signing key. So if they tried to do that and pass it back, guess what? It's going to be an invalid token and they'll get an unauthorized again. Okay, so there's no way to break this and subvert this JWT token. So how do we use this bearer token to actually test out our APIs that have the authorized attribute on it? Well, we can do that by adding JWT support right in Swagger, right in the Open API. Let's take a look at how to do this. Open up our serviceextensions.cs and let's add a new method called configure open API. This again extends the services collection. And we're going to do the services.add endpoints API Explorer. And then we're going to add Swagger Gen. We're going to add some options now. Generally in program.cs, it was just simply services.add Swagger Gen, open close parenthesis. But in here, we're allowed to pass some options and create some things like we add a security definition for bearer tokens. We do new open API security scheme. The scheme is bearer. The bearer format is JWT. We have a in parameter location.header, name is authorization. I mean, there's a lot of stuff here. Don't worry about what all this is, guys. You don't have to know this. This is pure boilerplate, just stuff you don't even have to know about, actually. So now that we have this method, all we have to do is now configure it. Go to the program.cs, locate where this was part of our program.cs since the very beginning. What we're going to do now is just change this so we can call our configure open API method, and this will now add in the following. Let's run this. So you can see now over here on the right-hand side of all of these, there's a little lock. And at the very top up here, there's actually an authorize. So you can either use one of the ones by the API calls or use the authorize. Either one works. And all we have to do is come down here to the security test. We'll try this out. Put in me this time. And we'll execute and we will get the bearer token. I'm going to copy this bearer token to the clipboard. Let me collapse this now. And remember, our weather forecast is the one. So we're going to click on that icon and we're going to actually put in the bearer token here. And we're going to click Authorize. So this sets the bearer token inside of the Open API so that it will be called or be passed to our endpoint here. So if we now try this out and we click Execute, it now works. Look at that. Because we're authorized to make calls, we now can execute these with that bearer token. Well, one of the things we had was claims. So we have claims in that token. How do we secure an endpoint using a claim? Earlier, we added this configure JWT authorization method, and it just simply returned services.add authorization. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to modify this add authorization here, and again, we're going to set some options. Well, what we're doing here is we're adding policies. So we're going to add policy get products claim, and the required claim would be get products. Remember, that was one of the claims that was added to me. Then we have get a product claim. That policy says that you need the claim get a product. Remember, that was both me and John. Then we have a search claim, we have an add product claim, we have an update product claim that require those 4 different claims right there, or 5 different claims that we have configured now. So all we have to do now is use claims, and we do that by, let's actually go and change our product controller and locate the get method here. So what we'll do is we'll add an authorize attribute just like we did on the weather one. But what we're going to do is set the policy now. The policy will be get products claim. I have that claim. John does not. So let's run this. So let's try to do the get API here again, right? And it'll come back with that 401 unauthorized. Okay, no problem. Let's go ahead and log in. Or actually, yeah, get the login, but we're going to use John K. because he is not authorized for the get products. But let's grab his bearer token. Let's copy this. Let's now come up here, authorize him, close this, and now let's execute. Wow, we're back to that 500 internal server error again, aren't we? Well, the problem is that we're actually getting a 403, but we're not handling that particular code. So we need to what? Go into our error controller again, and we have to add a 403. This time we'll put something like you are forbidden from this route, because that's what a 403 is, forbidden. You're authenticated, but you don't have the rights to do that. Let's now run this again. And I realized I just made a typo. Sorry about that. You are forbidden from this route. You are not forbidden from this route. So let's go ahead and try this again. So we run this. Let's go ahead and do the same thing. So we'll get John's bearer token. We'll copy that. We will put it into the little lock here. We'll now try running this, and we now should get the 403 forbidden. So it says you are forbidden from this route. Now let's go down here and execute this again. Let's get my bearer token, which should have that claim. And let's now go up here to the product get. Let's log out. Let's now reauthorize using my bearer token. Come in here, try this out, execute. Look at that, everything's working. So we now should get a 200 and we should get all of those product details back. There we go, because I am both authenticated and authorized. In this lesson, we added JWT packages to the Web API project. We created some security classes to authenticate the user and generate the JWT bearer token. We added claims and secured an endpoint, and we modified our error handling to handle security errors. Coming up next, get data from a database using the entity framework.